Hey guys, it's Jason Snavely, certified wildlife biologist and founder and president of Drop-Tine Wildlife Consulting, the Drop-Tine. Okay, I'm actually going to interrupt the intro. You guys have heard that enough. I am super excited about my guest today. This is actually in part his second go around because somebody forgot to hit record this morning or earlier today. So we are starting over. This is a perfectly timed podcast because a podcast I recorded yesterday and uploaded today with Doctors Bronson Strickland and Rick Haney sort of led into this sort of biomass versus nutrient density or quality, so quantity versus quality in the food plots. Now, I think Bronson kind of got out of the biomass in the woodland setting, and after listening to it, I probably should have done a better job of steering him back into the food plot setting. We are talking specifically about regenerative wildlife agriculture. So again, this is my second shot today. I have with me the great David Montgomery. Dr. David Montgomery, are you there?
Hey, Jason. Yep, I'm still here.
I am so sorry. I know I'm going to get a hefty bill from you. I just, of all the buttons and everything, I forgot to hit the big red one, the most important one. But actually, I'm glad that I get another go around because there were a couple things I would have done better.
Hey, second chances are often pretty good.
That's right. So I am going to go ahead and get started. Do you want to give a brief intro about what you do? I want to tell people that we will save book recommendations for the end of the podcast because I want you to listen to the whole podcast. But one of Dave's books, actually all of his books are great, but one of his books is my personal favorite, right up there. Many of you know that Fred Provenz's Nourishment book is kind of like a Bible to me. I've destroyed a copy and I now have a second copy. And one of Dave's books, I'll share which one is my personal favorite. It's a real this, but we will also talk about Dave and Ann's book, What Your Food Ate, here shortly. But I want to sort of jump into this and talk about soil health and nutrient density. Those of you who listen to the podcast know that some of the academics, the academicians, the university world, sort of, they look for the peer-reviewed literature, and they want to know where is the conclusive evidence, peer-reviewed, in the scientific format that proves our claim that soil health has a positive effect on the nutrient density, the nutrient profile, of course, soil organic matter, vitamin mineral content, phytochemical richness. We've talked about all this on other podcasts. So that's why I have Dave with me here today. And Dave, I want to start with this. We're going to talk about your paper, but if you can sort of give me how do I say this? A brief yes or no. I know if it's an it depends, I'd rather you not go that route, but it's an option on the table. I'm going to run through a few questions. This is for the guys and gals who don't have patience. I have some of these clients, they say, give me the best part, Jason, in the first 10 minutes. Like when I would tell the linemen, the first 5 plays, I want you guys to wear the opposition out. If you get a flag or a penalty, I don't care in the first 5 plays, wear them out. My daughter's a softball pitcher. I told her the first inning has got to be perfect. You've got to bring the heat, make it happen, set the stage, and then you'll win the rest of the way. So, yes or no to these brief questions with regards to nutrient density and overall nutritional profile of plants. I know that's kind of vague because obviously there's vitamins and minerals, and then we get into these phytochemicals and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you believe that there has been a decline? Yes or no? This is brief. Yes or no? We're going to extrapolate or expand on this here in a little bit. I've got like 3 or 4 of these. If you had to pick a yes or no, which one would you pick? Has there been a decline in the overall nutritional content of forages, vegetables, crops, etc., because of conventional farming practices For those who don't know what that means, that's basically plowing, synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, traditional farming.
The short answer is yes, but with one simple caveat is that would be with a broad definition of what is a nutrient, which turns out to be a very important question that hasn't been asked often enough.
Excellent. Hold that one in your back pocket, and that's fair enough. We'll cover that again. Do you believe that crop breeders have selected for traits focusing almost entirely on yields? And
so that's absolutely yes.
Okay, perfect. I when I started my seed company, I tried to call them premium seeds of superior genetics. Once I went down the soil health path, I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to get on all of my print, my website, and get that off, because the premium seeds of superior genetics, in my opinion, they've got to go away. They're junk. So you've agreed with that one. You're doing awesome. You're doing better than me. Okay, the next one. Heavy use of synthetic fertilizers, right, out of a bag or a spreader, etc. Do you believe that they have a negative impact on soil life and ultimately affect the uptake of, obviously nutrients and nourishment of crops?
The short answer to that is yes on the first half of it. It definitely affects communities of soil life in ways that are detrimental to the health of crops. That's a big part of what we go into in What's Your Food Aid. And, and whether they affect what gets taken up by crops is a lot more variable. But again, broadly considering things, not just in terms of what crops take up, but what crops make, phytochemicals, what they make in response to interactions with soil life, then the answer goes to definitely yes.
Excellent. I know this is really hard. Most people don't like to do this. I have had, just kind of laying the groundwork out. I was on a podcast. There were, I think, 3 or 4 of us, an assistant professor from NDSU who was a soil health specialist, and a Pheasants Forever maybe biologist, and then me, kind of the odd guy in the crowd, talking about deer and dirt. And the assistant professor, after I went on about, I really think we need to focus on soil health, on how we farm for food plots, for wildlife, and we should focus more on quality over quantity. Forget about yield, forget about tonnage and bushels. Don't get me wrong. I love to armor my soil with plenty of plant residue. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, do we need 5.5 foot tall forage soybeans in a monoculture stand for white-tailed deer? No, we absolutely do not. And we're missing the quality aspect of it. So please help me with these arguments. This gal jumped on me on this podcast and said, Jason, unfortunately, all of your claims about nutrient density and quality as a result of your soil health principles and practices is just not true. And you can't prove that in any randomly replicated peer-reviewed science. We, of course, bickered back and forth. I thought it was great for people to hear. The host never aired the podcast because it was clean, don't get me wrong, but it got a little bit heated. And that's sort of one thing I want you to address. If you listen to the podcast before this with Dr. Bronson Strickland, who's a good friend of mine, an incredible deer biologist and just obviously educator, period, he is stuck on biomass. And I let him he got out of the food plot sort of and into the woodland. I should have drew him back into that food plot setting. But I think we have focused, and I know you're going to talk about some things, including the dilution effect, et cetera. I'm not going to steal too much of your thunder, but now is where I'm going to let you extrapolate and expand on some of these ideas. Can you tell me why, if we're at a picnic, you're telling me that the nutritional quality of crops, and this could be anything, this could be food plots, right? I mean, it could be chicory and clover and brassicas and you name it, has declined over time because of conventional farming practices, meaning plowing and disking and synthetic fertilizers and the overuse of pesticides and insecticides, etc. Now you go.
Well, you've just sort of loaded me up with about 18 questions, but I can start going to some of this. is not a whole lot of peer-reviewed literature that gets directly to the heart of the question that you're asking. But there's an awful lot of peer-reviewed literature that gets at little pieces of the dots that you can string together to connect why it is you might think that farming practices that influence the health of the soil would cascade up into impacting the health of crops, livestock, and ultimately people. But there's a lot of dots to connect along the way and a lot of variability in there. And one of the things that characterizes the peer-reviewed literature is, other than it being peer-reviewed, which basically doesn't guarantee that it's conclusive. It just guarantees that some other people have looked at it and tried to pick it apart and said, "Oh, okay, this can pass muster." There's a lot of variability out there in sort of each step along that causal chain, but Ann and I, my wife and co-author, I'm trying to sort of figure out where to start with your list of questions. There is solid, Ann and my co-author and wife, who worked with me on What's Your Food Date, and I were both very curious about trying to get at answering that question. So what we did is we looked at the broad question of how do farming practices affect the nutritional profile of foods, the nutritional quality of foods. And the first thing you have to wrestle with that is the definition of, well, what's a nutrient? And it's been a source of a lot of confusion in the peer-reviewed literature in terms of trying to assess the effects of farming, because when you look in the nutritional world, generally what are defined as nutrients are compounds like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, things that are necessary for growth and that and survival, basically. But there's this whole other suite of compounds, phytochemicals, chemicals that plants make in response to environmental stimuli that are things like the beta-carotene in carrots, the lycopene in tomatoes, that have beneficial effects on plants. They make phytochemicals because they're useful to themselves, and they'll often make them in response to interactions with soil life. And they're things like antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, then when they get into the human body in terms of what they do for us. And there's good evidence to believe that conventional farming practices have reduced the levels of phytochemicals in crops. There's some evidence to suggest that they've reduced the mineral micronutrient abundance. There's a bunch of studies that have looked at that and concluded that those levels have dropped in the last 80 years or so. There's less solid evidence in terms of whether or not there's big differences in the kinds of things that most people consider nutrients, which are the macronutrients, the things that are needed for growth. So if you have a definition of nutrients that includes compounds that support good human health, or support crop health, that bolster immune systems and that help organisms defend against pests and pathogens, then there's good evidence that there have been declines. But you first have to define what you're meaning by a nutrient, because you can find all kinds of papers in the nutritional literature that argue that there haven't been big nutritional effects because of the way they define nutrients. So that's sort of the first thing to get out of the way. But there are very solid studies that have looked at, and there's a term called the dilution effect that looks at how the abundance of mineral micronutrients in particular have declined in crops. Mostly people have looked at grains, fruits, and vegetables over the past 80 years. As crop breeders bred for high yields, they didn't simultaneously yield for maintaining the mineral micronutrient uptake at similar levels. So think about it this way. If a wheat plant is growing twice as many seed heads as its predecessor, so it's been bred to have higher yields, but it's still taking the same amount of zinc up out of the soil, then it's dividing that zinc that gets into the seeds by twice as many seed heads, so it ought to have about half as much. And that dilution effect is, it's acknowledged, it's well known, it's not a big mystery. What's more contentious is whether there's an effect on the disruption of soil life in terms of how it affects mineral micronutrient uptake and phytochemical production in crops. And that's the end of nutrient density that Ann and I were really very interested in. And we couldn't find, there's studies that look at individual minerals and individual practices But we were very interested in that question of, do regenerative farming practices that combine no-till methods with cover crops and the diversity of crops to build healthier, more fertile soils, what would that do to nutrient density? And we didn't find a lot of evidence for that in terms of peer-reviewed papers because it hadn't really been looked at. So we set out to try and look at that with a little bit of a study for ourselves. And we could talk at some length about that if you'd like.
But we will.
You know, the individual pieces of those connections of how does tillage and overuse of nitrogen fertilizers, overuse of herbicides in particular, how does that affect soil communities of soil life and scramble the soil microbiome? There's pretty solid research on that. And there's also pretty solid research that's showing that can disrupt the mycorrhizal fungi. That in turn, there's very solid research that shows that are central to the ability of plants to take up mineral micronutrients from the soil. The symbiotic relationships between soil life and plants in particular that Ann and I wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature a few years ago, are very vulnerable to disruption by both tillage and nitrogen fertilizer use. And the mechanisms behind that are pretty well understood. There's the degree to which it characterizes broadly across all of agriculture. It hasn't really been looked at in a great degree. But you can go and you can identify the connections sort of on each step of the way. And what does, say, mineral micronutrient deficiencies do to the health of crops? What do changes in the beneficial community of organisms around the roots of crops in their soil microbiome due to the ability of plants to resist pests and pathogens? And it's pretty solid. There's peer-reviewed papers that review the effects of, say, herbicides on the ability of plants to resist pests and pathogens. And interestingly, it appears that it can undermine plants' defense systems because it scrambles their microbial partners in the soil, the communities of life they really evolved to thrive in the presence of through mutually beneficial interactions where the crops provide the soil microbes with exudates, food basically, and the soil microbial life, bacteria and fungi, will do things like excavate zinc particles out of the soil and deliver them to the crops in exchange for sugar. They can stimulate plants to make phytochemicals central to their defense. So you can sort of go through and look at all those connections, and the pieces can line up like beads on a string. But it's difficult to basically try and connect soil health to human health directly. And we couldn't find a systematic comparison of regenerative and conventional farms growing the same cultivar in the same locations. You could find comparisons where people would, compare an organic field on the East Coast with something in the Midwest or something. You kind of go like, well, how good of a comparison is that?
Yeah. So at the beginning of my notes here, I'm going to jump back to this. I have this highlighted and written on my notepad. It says, "You are what you eat eats." And this is sort of how we started our kind of conversation. I brought that up to you in an email, and you said, hey, interestingly, it may be a good time to podcast about this because I have this new book coming out, and I pre-ordered it, I don't know, 5-6 months ago? I don't know what it was. And and that's, I've heard that comment before. You are what you eat eats, right? People often say you are what you eat, which I agree. But what about what you eat? What did it eat? And oftentimes when you're thinking about a cow, it's sort of easy to relate, or even a white-tailed deer. It's easy to, kind of relate to that. But what did the plants that your deer ate eat? In other words, those plants are extracting nourishment from the soil, or maybe they're not at all, because maybe those soils are a completely dysfunctional ecosystem. So I guess I want to kind of bring this back to deer and wildlife, because that's what my listeners, although a lot of them are interested in the agriculture as well. But speaking about deer, do you believe in just a general, I guess we'll just envelope this in a general question. Do you believe that if we were to transition or move out of conventional farming practices, and you named them all, the plowing and, obviously the chemicals and the synthetics and just constant disturbance, into a more soil health focused regenerative ag, management approach, could that factually enhance the nutrient? And again, I'm going to say nutrient density, which includes phytochemical richness and, there's such a broad, just overall health as opposed to just quantity. Is that a feasible statement, or am I just selling snake oil when I say that?
No, I think you could expect to see differences in both mineral micronutrients and in phytochemicals in crops or plants that are grown in healthy fertile soil, as opposed to crops that are grown in degraded soils with compromised microbial communities in them. The degree to which that would affect deer, I'm not aware of direct studies that have addressed that. But all the sort of pieces that you would put together to support that argument, the individual pieces, have been done, and that's what we try and do and relate in What's Your Food Aid, is to take the science that's out there in the peer-reviewed literature, because we have a source document for the book that has about 1,000 peer-reviewed papers listed in it. They're the things that we actually read to basically evaluate what we think were the potential connections and whether they held water. And that source document's freely available from our website, dig2grow.com. You don't have to buy the book to get the source material, because it's nobody should have to compile that list of papers again. And I'm not recommending that everybody read them.
I was going to say, am I a nerd if that excites me to go to that? I just saw that in the book referenced, and I'm like, that's enough reading for the summer for me.
Yeah, you're totally in the nerd club, but you're in good company on that one. But it's one of these things where What Your Food Aid, the book, is really an effort to synthesize what's been learned in different disciplines. Because when you're looking at even trying to connect soil health to the health of deer, you're talking about soil science, you're talking about plant physiology, you're talking about animal diets. I mean, there's at least 3 completely different disciplines that you need to kind of get your head around to try and even think about what might structure the connections.
Right.
And it's very rare for there to be studies that actually take on, directly questions that transcend many disciplines. So I think that there's good reason to argue that there are connections in the direction that you're arguing. We have some evidence from the crop world with this preliminary study that we did that you can see differences. But there is an awful lot of variability out there. So the thing that I tend to go to in thinking about, how a diet affects the health of an animal, whether it's a deer or a person, is that there's 2 components to it. There's the what you eat, which relates to the diversity of the diet, and then there's also it's what's in what you eat, and that relates back to the question of what's your food aid, or what you I forget how you put it, what you eat aid. And that's where the soil health issue would come in terms of that second piece. So if you had sort of a monocultural stand of even sort of crops that are grown in, or feed for a deer grown in healthy soil, that's not going to be as good as a diverse stand of things grown in healthy soil, and a monocultural stand grown in poor soil is going to be at the bottom of the barrel.
There's a lot of people out there yelling at you right now. But I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. I agree. Totally.
I'm kind of used to that. I mean, the funny thing in researching these books on soil is that, my background is as a geologist. I don't have a particular, I didn't go into writing these books with a particular viewpoint. And I've been yelled at by organic farmers, too, for arguing that organic farming helped destroy the Roman Empire, because too much tillage too often can destroy the soil just as much as too much nitrogen for too long.
Bingo. That's why I had fun. When I started, I'm no longer on the social media platforms, but when I started this, it was kind of interesting. You had, some information to post, and there were some jokes about Snavely going organic for deer, and I laughed, and I thought, no, that's not even close. Actually, that's even worse. I wouldn't go that route. So since you kind of mentioned that, you mentioned this paper, I'd like to sort of go through this paper. This is a peer-reviewed paper. It was published this year, January of 2022. And the title, Soil Health and Nutrient Density, preliminary comparison of regenerative and conventional farming. So just sort of lay it out for us. What were you and your co-authors aiming to do here, and kind of some of these results that I have highlighted in stars and dog ears on. Kind of share some of the results, if you can, in a nutshell.
Yeah, sure. Well, when Ann and I were writing What Your Food Ate, one of the key things that we came up against was that most of the comparisons of nutrient density, defined broadly the way we're doing it here, that are out there in the literature really just sort of looked at comparisons of organic and conventional foods. And we did a bit of a review of that. And
in other words, Dave, here I am interrupting you. In other words, the comparisons we're looking at conventional, meaning plowing, chemicals, fertilizers, versus up against this idea of organic, which is no chemicals, but we're going to plow the snot out of it to quote unquote control weeds and avoid chemical usage. But they completely missed the best option, which is usually the case in political conversations, religious conversations, and just fireside arguments with buddies. This part in the middle, which is far better than both of them, soil health, regenerative, looking at the system like a living, like farming in nature kind of a thing, right? They missed that the research has thus far missed that aspect.
Yeah, the aspect was less focused on soil health than it was on essentially chemical use or no chemical use. And that's, if you look at the effects of both conventional farming and organic farming on soil health, there's a huge range of effects because there's a huge range of practices in both of those worlds, the organic and the conventional world. And I've been on organic farms that have absolutely incredible, some of the most beautiful, healthy, fertile soil I've ever seen. And some of them even do a little tillage, but they can get away with it because they've got really healthy, fertile soil. And I've also been on organic farms that have completely degraded their soil by plowing too often in an environment where that really accelerated the loss of soil organic matter. And they didn't have a supply of it in terms of compost and mulch and manure adequate to maintaining it. And I've also been on conventional farms that have rebuilt healthy, fertile soils, greatly as a result of reducing plowing and greatly reducing chemical use, but that still use some chemicals, so they were not organic. And many conventional farms around the world have degraded soil organic matter by about 50%. That's the figure that sticks out from both the U.S. and international comparisons I've read in the peer-reviewed literature. And so there's this, if you think about soil health as the connection between the soil life and the health of crops and what gets into them, particularly in terms of micronutrients and phytochemicals, then that sort of the broad brush of organic versus conventional doesn't quite capture it. So what Ann and I couldn't find a comparison in the literature that basically used soil health as the metric to compare different farms with in similar settings. And you'll often find in that organic versus conventional literature that people will be growing, take a field that's been conventionally worked for 100 years, convert it to organic, and then grow a crop variety that's intended to that was bred for success or for high yield under high nitrogen conditions, and then do the comparisons there. But anyway, we wanted to do a comparison to try and assess for ourselves whether or not there seemed to be something to this notion that soil health could impact nutrient density. And so what we wanted to do is we basically picked the approach of doing a small number of paired farms across the U.S. where we'd get a regenerative farm that we were aware of or that we were connected with through people that we were aware of, and have them grow a crop that was the same as their conventional neighbor next door. And then we would test the nutritional profile of those, looking at the mineral elements, looking at some key phytochemicals and vitamins. And so we basically worked with Ray Archuleta on that, where Ray sampled the soils at all the paired farms that we looked at, and we had the farmers send in a sample of their crops to directly to a soils lab, and then looked at the differences between them. And what we found was that the soil health, the soil organic matter on the regenerative farms was anywhere between 1.5. Basically, it was always higher and substantially so on the regenerative farms and the conventional farms, both in terms of organic matter and in terms of the Haney test. And so the soil health seemed to be different, but these were the same soils in the same region, just farmed differently. And the regenerative farmers, the regenerative farms had all been using a combination of no-till cover crops and diversity for a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 10 years. Some of the farms had been no-till for much longer than that, but this was places that had been using that combination for in that 5 to 10 year window. And 2 of the farms were no-till vegetable farms that used pretty different methods than the row crop farms that the other 8 were. And those no-till vegetable farms had the highest soil health and the highest soil organic matter, in part because they used a lot of compost and mulch, and they imported organic matter. So we didn't look directly at the fertilization regime.
So you're saying, I heard you say something, imported organic matter, and obviously sometimes it's probably, the vegetable deal is probably a smaller, more manageable environment.
Yeah, exactly.
So would that infer then that those who export organic material from their properties, i.e. hay, crops, etc., would trend in the opposite direction, correct?
It's certainly possible, depending on sort of what else they were doing on the land and how much organic matter they were able to produce as a consequence of growing those crops.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it might depend a bit on how they're actually raising it and the state of their soil. You can get away with supporting some export of organic matter if you have really healthy soil, if you're not organic matter challenged in terms of your soil. But if it's already degraded, then the more that you export, you're not working it in a positive direction.
So I know I'm a nerd, so I have your paper in front of me, and I know I didn't warn you on this, that we were going to pick this apart, but I'm looking at this just for the numbers. The regenerative farms on the paired results had 3 to 12% soil organic matter. So those of you who, obviously run any kind of test, whether it's Haney or even the standard, 3 to 12% soil organic matter is pretty darn good. Now go to the conventional farms, and they were 2 to 5% organic matter. So obviously big difference there. And then the soil health scores from the Haney test on the regenerative farms ranged from 11 to 30. The mean was 20. And then over to conventional farms, the soil health scores was 3 to 14. So from 11 to 30 and down to 3 to 14. So those are just some of the numbers. But you did mention here, the regenerative farms were consistently higher with up to 5 times more soil organic matter and up to 7 times higher soil health scores. So that seems to me to be sort of significant.
Yeah, we found consistently, it was hard to argue based on that the soil on the regenerative farms was not better than the soil on the conventional farms. Now, the one thing I should point out on this study is that probably the most important word in the title is the word preliminary. And why is that word prominently in there? Because this is a small sample size study. I mean, it's really small sample sizes. So it's meant to basically be interpreted as something that indicates that, hey, it looks like there's something going on here that deserves a lot more attention. But this is, it's controlled in the sense that we have these paired farms with similar soil, similar climate, everything, similar crop variety that was tested. But they're small sample sizes, and it's intended really, I think, to be thought about as, maybe there's really actually something to this, and there should be a lot more systems level research on these connections. A lot of the research that looks, particularly in terms of the effect of farming practices on soil organic matter, will look at, say, no-till in isolation. And there's many studies find that no-till doesn't do a whole lot to the full soil profile, as finds that it does increase it. But when you get into reviewing those studies, the ones that look at farms where they had no-till, cover crops, and diversity, it almost always increases soil organic matter. Mm-hmm. But they tend to be interpreted and analyzed in terms of individual practices. Do cover crops increase soil organic matter? Well, as a standalone issue, it's much, the more pertinent way to look at it, the way that I've come to see things, is at a systems level, looking at the combination of no-till cover crops and diversity rather than as individual pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And we laid the reasons out in What Your Food Ate, and also I think I did that in Growing a Revolution, in terms of that combination of practices is what it takes to really cultivate a robust population of beneficial microorganisms in the soil. You need to not disturb them, you need to feed them, and you need to give them partners to work with. And those three things translate into no-till, cover crops, and diversity. So if you're studying sort of one piece of that, you're really looking at a wobbly stool. And the results, from what I can tell in perusing the peer-reviewed literature, are that it's much harder to show a impact and connection when you just look at one of those pieces than when you look at all three. But there aren't many studies that look at a systems level in all three, and I think for fairly simple reasons. It's harder to fund. It's harder to task to graduate students in terms of the lifespan of one of their theses of just a couple of years worth of study. And as scientists, we tend to like to break systems into individual pieces and look at how those pieces work. And I like to use the analogy, of like a watch. It's like, sure, I could take a watch apart and study all the individual pieces, but the individual pieces don't work well by themselves.
Anybody who listened to my podcast with Bronson and Rick probably just connected some dots. I completely agree with that statement, and they've already heard that, so I won't go through that. But I do want to say I understand your but on the low sample size. I completely understand that. The purpose of bringing that up in the academic scientific arena, but I'm sold 100% regardless. I mean, you guys went to California, Montana, North Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, PA, Connecticut. That's pretty well distributed across the country. And I mean, I'm reading the paper. It's actually one of the most exciting papers to read. And let me just go to the no-till vegetables. Now, again, this could be food plot crops. This could be agricultural crops. It doesn't matter. Correct me if I'm wrong. They're looking at cabbage in a regenerative farm in California, had 46% more potassium, 31% more vitamin E, and 31% more vitamin B1, 60% more B3, 23% more B5 than the regularly tilled organic field. The regenerative cabbage also had 41% more calcium. There you go, dear guys. 22% more potassium, again, and less than a third of the sodium, 35% more carotenoids, 74% more phytosterols, which I believe competes with cholesterol. Hint, hint, people. Things that have, high in phytosterols are like, I'm kind of a personal health geek. I've gotten off that path here in recent years, but when I had a lot of gut dysfunction, fruits and vegetables and whole grains seemed to fix a lot of stuff. So I guess what I'm looking at here, I just want to throw this out there, and then regenerative cabbage had 50% more zinc and magnesium. For those of you who, I take a lot of zinc, not a lot, but I take the right amount of zinc and magnesium, and I don't get sick often at all, if ever. And the magnesium helps me sleep. So I think it's limited in my diet as well. But I don't know. Those are pretty big numbers, Dave.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, if I was given the choice of which cabbage to eat, of those that we sampled, I would take the regenerative one hands down. It was way superior in terms of what you're getting for that food. Now, it's, again, a small comparison, but what really impressed us and drove us to, not just sort of report these results in the book, but also to send it out to a journal for peer review, is that not so much any one of these individual comparisons, which suffer from the small sample size comparison, but the fact that across the board, it looked like we saw things trending in the same direction. And that's where there's really kind of two sort of standards of what you might call evidence or proof that we can think about in terms of science. And one is in terms of the proving conclusively with 99% certainty that there's a real effect going on. And that's a high bar for things that are highly variable, like what gets into our crops. But if we look at it in terms more of like the common sense level of, which is better, which of those cabbages is better, the answer is actually pretty clear in terms of that. And in terms of seeing on these regenerative farm comparisons that the regenerative farms had consistently higher soil health, and particularly in terms of phytochemicals, the phytosterols, the total polyphenols and total carotenoids, I think are what we measured. It was consistently that the regenerative stuff was better. The minerals were more variable. The mineral micronutrients, the regenerative ones, were generally better or higher values. And to me, the several types of tests and comparisons that we made, they all were pointing in the same direction that suggests there's something to this argument that soil health impacts nutrient density. Obviously, there's need for a lot more research. Any academic will say that, but I think in this case it really is warranted. But that the direction sure looks like that we point to in what your food ate, that how we raise our crops and how we feed and raise our livestock is actually influencing what gets into the human food supply. And with an interest and emphasis on deer, I mean, they're one connection in that chain, and it just not as many people eating venison as eating beef, obviously, but the similar kinds of arguments hold in terms of the importance of mineral micronutrients and phytochemicals to health, and understanding how those things get into our crops or into plants in the wild is really sort of central. And all the sort of pieces of evidence one can sort of pull from different disciplines seem to point in the same direction, that there's a reason to believe that there should be an effect there.
Okay, so the argument's over. Biomass is not number one. If I'm trying to armor my soil, yes, I'm putting plant residue on the ground in the form of biomass, especially my clients in Texas and Mississippi and parts of Louisiana and then across the Piedmont and the Carolinas, etc. No. Is the argument not over? I don't know, but this is my opportunity to urge. I'm trying to convince, and I know it's not taking a lot because Dr. Strickland loves this stuff as well at Mississippi State, but I would love to see my alma mater sort of lead the way as this relates to white-tailed deer. I know I took up a lot more of your time in my snafu of forgetting to hit the big red record button, so I won't keep you a whole lot longer. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this sort of debate about, and I love the dilution effect. I hope people heard that, but this whole debate on, more of a crap thing. This is how I talk to my clients. You have this high biomass forage soybean, which is a great thing in small amounts, but if that's all you have, you're gonna lose deer. They're gonna leave the property to self-medicate and to diet mix and to do other things. They need more than just biomass and volume and tonnage and yield. They need quality.
Yeah, and the same argument holds for people. When we think about, we focused on prioritizing yields at the expense of nutrient density, the inadvertent expense of nutrient density. Nobody bred crops to be low nutrient density. It's just that they didn't breed them to be high nutrient density and high yield. And so, when we look at the human food supply, I think we're at a point where we need to think about, how to rethink our agricultural priorities to not only grow high yields, because, we need the yields to feed people, but how to grow high yields of high quality food. And that's where I think that, in terms of looking at wildlife and animals that are not, directly domesticated, the same kind of principles would hold in terms of their need for a diversity of diet, and also for their need for, quantity. They need enough to eat. But we probably haven't paid enough attention to the quality of what they're getting as well. And the improvement of soil health really provides an avenue for trying to provide the most for in terms of nutrient density for whoever's eating what we grow, whether it's deer grazing off of forage biomass or cover crops, or whether it's a person shopping at a grocery store trying to pick which foods to eat.
Mm-hmm.
both of those things really matter. We need enough, but we also need quality to support our health.
I agree.
And I worry that in prioritizing, sort of, biomass above all, whether in animal science or in the human food supply, we've basically conflated health and nutrition. That's the wrong way to put it. I'm sort of
well, I think
blanking on words here, but
I always bring up the
short-change nutrition in the interests of volume.
Yes, I agree, and I always bring up the book Dorito Effect. I can't even remember the author, but I remember just reading that book, trying to push it on everybody because it was eye-opening. But so I think this is where I'm going to lead into, and you sort of dropped the name of one of my favorite books that you happen to author. Growing a Revolution was sort of an eye-opener for me as far as how other people, meaning in other countries and places that most of us don't ever think about, farm and practice agriculture. And it was a journey that I wish I would have been on. But it interests me that we are a country that probably, and I know you can confirm this after your travels, that probably wastes more food than any other people's, but yet we are the most undernourished because of empty calories. No offense, McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and everything at the grocery store. So would you say that's accurate?
I would say that we are overfed and undernourished. Yes.
Yes. And we just happen to spend probably more than anybody on healthcare, yet we have some of the most advanced medicines and hospitals, et cetera. So I fear that transfers over to the critters that I am trying to manage on properties. And I think this research is fantastic. And I thank you for doing the work you've done. So Growing a Revolution I get a lot of emails and texts and stuff asking for book recommendations. I know many of you have already read it. But for those of you who are looking, Growing a Revolution is phenomenal. The Hidden Half in Nature is the other great one. And Dirt, I think, was your first one, wasn't it?
Yeah. So if people are interested in sort of the backstory of how degrading soils has affected past societies, Dirt's really the book for you. And that's what got me started on it, because as a geologist, I'm used to looking backwards through time. And the more I got into researching what I thought was going to be a book on how soil erosion affected human history, the more I realized I was actually writing a history of farming, because it was really about how tillage, how the plow undermined society after society around the world, just too slow for people to notice day to day, but for the effects to really rack up over generations and really drive, some large-scale human migrations. The Hidden Half of Nature, the other one that Ann and I wrote together, looks at the science behind why regenerative agriculture works. It looks at how microbial life has partnerships with plant life, and why the human gut is sort of a parallel ecosystem to the zone around the roots of the plant, just inside out. And that's really how nature works in terms of the health and defense of higher organisms, plants and animals. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you really liked Growing a Revolution. It was a fun book to research and write. I got to travel around the world and interview farmers who had been very successful at regenerating the health and fertility of their land. And the new one, What Your Food Ate, really tries to take that to really go into what's known and not known about the kind of connections and questions that you were asking today about how the way we grow our food influences what our food does for us. And I think a lot of us don't tend to think about crops as having a diet, but they do. You just have to think about it filtered through the way a plant experiences the world. And it turns out that what we feed our livestock and what deer would be eating as well would have a big influence on the fat composition of their bodies in ways that medical science suggests ought to have an impact on supporting human health or not. And so it's been fun researching these books. We try and integrate a little bit of history to help the science go down, but it's all based on peer-reviewed stuff. There's these 1,000 papers in this review that in the source list for What's Your Food Ate. And I don't encourage everybody to go read those papers, but they're there if you can. If you want to, go for it. If you're glutton for punishment, do it. But part of my job is to read that stuff and translate it and try and synthesize and put it together. And fortunately, Anne is a very good partner on that. She's a biologist. And when you think about what is the soil and what makes for a healthy, fertile soil, it's geology meeting biology. So we've worked together as a team on this and literally argue over every word in the book. So it's quite an effort, but we're glad that it's out there and encourage people to read it and think about it. And these kind of questions deserve a lot more attention. But I think it can help reshape and rethink the direction of agriculture if we really internalize this. And I'm really curious about your experience with wild animals like deer. And I will also put in a plug for Fred Provenza's book Nourishment for people who are interested in that subject, because that was a go-to source for Ann and I as well. Fred's done his homework.
Yeah, he is definitely a treasure. Man, you just threw so many things at me there at once. I will say from a deer standpoint and a wildlife standpoint, is our farms are, those of us who have been down this path 5, 6, and up to 8 years, 7 years, our farms are exploding with life, and the food chain, food web stuff from 5th grade science now makes a lot more sense. People like in my household, my family says, man, we have more coyotes than we ever had. And I smile because I know that Aldo Leopold would be proud, because without the predator, you wouldn't have the prey, and the rest of the chain would collapse. Understanding I'd rather have wolves. I know I'm going to get emails from that one. But there's a reason that predators and prey and everything in the middle are there. I do want to say that when we started with this, I had clients, and myself included, we were on the edge of the cliff because our yields, our biomass, everything was far, well, let's say we had 4 or 5 inch plants as opposed to 4 and 5 foot tall plants. And we were, we didn't know what to do. We're not going to feed deer. We're not going to attract mature bucks. And I had many clients that would send me texts and, pictures, et cetera, and call me and say, hey, I'm not expecting a good deer season this year. And then the exact opposite happened. And they would say, what are they eating? They're constantly out there. I can't get in and out of the field. I can't get in and out of the woods because they're in the plots in the middle of the day at times when prey species and mature bucks should not be eating. And I would say, hey, there's no science to prove this, but they're self-medicating because guess what? They couldn't go to the pharmacy. They couldn't get a vaccine. So they're self-medicating. They're diet mixing. You've just offered them diversity. You've eliminated all the disturbance, the chemical, the tillage, etc. This is the right path. I have yet had anyone quit for a legitimate reason other than they just can't stop in life and they're doing 7,000 things and they, just don't have the patience to do it. I want to say about your books, the reason I really liked Growing a Revolution, it was a great read. I was super pissed when it finished because it should have and could have been much thicker. I want to say that you've carried that over to What Your Food Ate, in that I love how you break it down into soil, plant, and then how does it go? Animal and people. It's broken down, easy to digest. It is not a super thick, crazy read for those of you who are trying to decide if you want to. I know Fred's book, some people sent me a message and said, oh my gosh, it was a lot, but for a dork like me, it was perfect. So thank you for all those books. Thank you for your time. I'm openly admitting I forgot to hit record. Fortunately, we didn't go too awfully long, but if there's anything you want to add on this whole topic, I don't want to keep you any longer, but feel free to throw anything else out there about, again, the argument I face on a daily basis, Dave, is Snavely, you've lost your mind. Your plants are not any better than these plants. And I feel like the older the seeds I can go back to, if I could find a seed saver somewhere, and I've done this, they're far, far healthier, far more attractive to wildlife and people, if given the chance, than the quote-unquote improved genetics.
And it sounds like you have deer voting with their feet about whether it's good or better. And that's very interesting evidence in and of itself. One of the complexities in terms of looking at the human food chain is that with the food processing industry and flavorants, we've kind of broken the cycle that connects flavor to health, which we also write about in What Your Food Ate. But, your deer don't have that impediment in between. They're able to sort of go and directly to it. And it strikes me that that's a very interesting and good experiment that, while qualitative, is still meaningful. Right? Proof's in the pudding kind of a deal.
Well, it is if you're the guy with a bow at full draw or a rifle propped up on whatever, and you're happy. Yeah. And by the way, the positive ecological impact during the process, meaning, and I'm not saying I'm anti-chemical, but as we eliminate and minimize chemicals and synthetic fertilizers, not to mention the economic savings, but I've had people say, I've never seen this bug. My daughter and I described a bug the other day in the field like it looked like a tank. I've never seen it, and I've always been interested in bugs as a kid. It's like there's butterflies and birds and insects, and obviously the turkey poults love all that, and it's just one thing after another. I can't imagine why somebody wouldn't want to farm and manage this way, but at the same time, I'm excited that everybody doesn't, because I'm not a herd mentality kind of guy. I like being considered the oddball. And the thing that Snavely's doing, and then they come up here and they're like, oh my gosh, there's life everywhere.
Well, the thing about new ideas is that they're generally considered crazy until they're shown to work. And I think we're well on the way to showing that, when done right, regenerative practices that build the health and fertility of the soil really do cascade up into a healthier ecosystem like you're talking about there, but also into more viable and profitable farms. That was one of the things that turned me into a real optimist on this issue, was how it really sort of, when done right and stuck with, it can really turn a lot of things around. The last note that maybe I'll offer is that, in terms of the books, if people want to check out and get some interested in ideas on what's actually in them, you could look at our website, dig2grow.com, dig2grow.com. And they're available. It should be available from any place that you would normally get books. They're all available on Audible books as well. And Ann and I go through a lot of work to try and make the story interesting, because we're perfectly aware, as people who have read way too many journal articles in our lives for our professional activities, we're perfectly aware of how, generally boring they are. And so we go to a lot of effort to try and find interesting characters from history and tell their story in ways that is true to the science and bring that up to date as well. And so in a way, what we've done with What Your Food Ate is to try and synthesize the last century's worth of science that relates to these kind of things. And it suggests to us that we really need to point agriculture in a different and more regenerative direction. And, that's going to extend across to the kind of stuff that you do.
That's a great way to wrap up right there. Well, listen, right. Dave, okay. Thank you so much for spending the time and a little bit of extra time, since I couldn't operate the technology. Your work. Thanks for doing your work. That's what I wanted to acknowledge. I'm glad that we don't have enough, but the work that you've done and will continue to do, no doubt, is appreciated by even those weird people like me in the deer world and the wildlife world. So keep it up. Thank you so much, and I'm going to let you go so you can hang up and run on with your day before I wrap up my podcast. So thank you.
All right, Jason. No worries. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Take care. We'll see you later.
Sounds good. Have a great one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Yep. Thank you for listening to today's podcast with David Montgomery. And of course, thank you, Dave, for spending a little bit of time with us today, talking about your journey and the incredible work that you are doing as it relates to soil health and nutrient density of crops. And I am convinced 110%, although I enjoy reading the peer-reviewed literature, I've seen it in the field. There is undoubtedly a link between soil health and wild game health And yes, that includes white-tailed deer health. So again, thanks everybody. Any comments, questions, concerns, whatever, email them to me at jason@droptineseed.com. And I've been reviewing a lot of emails lately. I try to answer as many as I can, but I do read all of them. So I really enjoy the feedback. Reviews, ratings. Guys, this is a self-funded podcast. You could do me a huge favor by jumping on the app that you acquire your podcasts on and leave ratings and reviews. I'm going to read, I think it's the most recent or one of them, from Texas Bald Rock. Let's see, obviously from Texas. The title is Original and Usable Content. Jason's content is always original and well-researched. He and his guests explain complex topics that you can put to use in the field. I liked the podcast so much, and the results I was seeing, I became a client. I appreciate that. Obviously, Texas Bald Rock is from Texas. Not exactly sure which one that is with that name on there, but hey, shoot me an email, text, or call me and let me know who that was, and I'll send you something free, a hat, a shirt, or whatever. So again, please support the podcast through the ratings and reviews, and we will have a lot more coming to you on soil health and regenerative wildlife agriculture. Thanks again for listening.